Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, at this point I have over 250 hours in Shadow of the Erdtree itself, not even counting all of my time in the base game of Elden Ring, and within this I have killed every boss there is to find, at least a few times each, honestly, especially the Remembrance bosses, which I've killed a few more times than that. And so I thought it'd be fun to just sort of rate every single boss in the game based on my own opinions. This isn't the ones that cause me frustration or anything like that, it's just my feelings about their fight and their existence within the world, and as a heads up, just for dramatic presentation, the further right within a tier a boss is, the closer it is to going up to the next tier, for a bit of, extra context. Without further ado then, in the F tier we have the Furnace Golem bosses. There are a ton of these. They are sort of the Erdtree avatar replacements for the DLC, and the first time that you fight one, it is sort of neat for sure. A big, imposing, just burning torch, basically just hanging out, shooting loads of fire at you and one-shotting most people when they first get here with its stomps. But then you find a second one, and it has way higher health and stagger thresholds, and this keeps climbing and climbing, and then there are some that can only be killed by throwing pots into their heads, and while that's a neat sort of puzzle solution, it is really sort of sad when you find one of those and you don't have any pots on you already. I think it's a really neat concept for a boss, but I think it's just sort of not really fun to engage with in either version of the fight. I don't enjoy fighting these things. It takes a tedious amount of time to get through them, even with a high stagger weapon, which is supposed to be what counters them, and while throwing pots into their head is a fun solution to this, it is still just a repetitive action. The more times that you fight them and the higher their health pools get, the further into the game that you find even more of them, which just brings my aggravations even further to the forefront. Moving on to the D tier, I've got Demi-Human Queen Mariga. She doesn't really do much, she's not that special, and she's basically just a copy of a base game boss, but with a different name. That's all I have to say about that. Deathrite Bird. This was a fun find of the DLC, but ultimately it's extremely similar to the same version of this boss from the Consecrated Snowfields, aside from, very slight changes, and it's not an enemy type that I particularly enjoy fighting in the first place either. Tree Sentinels. There are two of these in the Hinterlands area of the DLC. One has a halberd and a shield, the other a halberd and a torch. Again, they are very much mostly carbon copies of the base game bosses, but with DLC level scaling, and they're fun to just sort of wail on or use as target dummies, but they aren't really special in any particular way, aside from the area that they protect being an interesting lore spot, I suppose. Then we have the Falling Star Beast of the DLC. Again, my main reason for having it this low is just that it is so incredibly similar to a base game boss that it just creates no real excitement in me to see it pop up. It doesn't really feel like a fun callback. It's not like if Melania herself were to show up randomly as an extra boss in the DLC with different attacks. It's just a Falling Star Beast. But hey, I do like the space of the arena that you can fight it in, and I do still enjoy the rhythm of a Falling Star Beast fight from the base game. I just, heavily prefer things that are actually new. Speaking of which, the Black Jail Knight, the first boss that many players actually found within this expansion in the Western Nameless Mausoleum, right near the first site of grace that you get to. West as in Western fantasy, knight aesthetic, and so this is the first Nameless Warrior, and the one themed around the knight aesthetic. Only the thing is, this means that he has super high poise because he's wearing heavy armor, he does a ton of damage because the weapon he uses is just good in general, but he lacks the sort of creativity behind his design that the other Nameless Mausoleum bosses feel like they have to me. And as far as the fight goes, the other three all have pretty unique weapons, pretty unique ways of attacking, two of them using new weapon types entirely, and one with a particularly special, unique version of a weapon, whereas this is just an NPC-style boss fight against a guy with a big sword, and that's fine, but fine is about all I feel about it. After that is the Jagged Peak Drake. There are a couple of these, but these are basically the same as all the base game Drake enemies with the addition of very, very occasional use of fire lightning. I think that fire lightning is really cool, but they use it so rarely and not really in any inventive ways, it might as well be regular lightning, and after the base game, I'm just sort of tired of your standard Drake. As well, on a similar note, Ancient Dragon Senesax. This one gets a slight pass, which is why it sits at the top of the D tier rather than lower with the Jagged Peak Drakes. It is basically just an ancient dragon fight from the base game with very little changes, but it is in a pool of water, which obviously makes you take even more damage from lightning attacks, so that's not very nice. But then the lore of this is that this is one of the ancient dragons from Placidusax's side of this sort of inter-dragon conflict that actually defected and retreated here with Bale and the Drakes, and this adds just a bit more intrigue to the whole concept of this dragon war. They aren't mindless, powerful beasts vying for power, they have thoughts, inner conflict, emotions, and it sort of humanizes the whole thing, even the lower members of their actual organizations. Moving up to the C tier then, these are bosses that I consider pretty average, at least by the standards of the expansion. They aren't necessarily bad by any means, but I consider any good parts that they have to be evened out in some way, or just find them otherwise unmemorable or sort of average. Starting this then is Black Knight Adrid. He is a Black Knight boss, just a boss version of the Black Knight enemies roaming around the expansion. He's got big smashes, and I do like the sort of lore of the Black Knights being related to the Crucible Knights and how that's somewhat revealed with him, but this one is definitely far less interesting than the other Black Knight boss of the DLC, which is why he is the lower one on the list. Past that is Commander Gaius, the first Remembrance boss here. His lore is absolutely interesting. The Albinaric rival of Radahn and gravity magic, his sort of mirror matchup mounted on his boar. I love all of that, and the fight is just genuinely painful to me. You can ride Torrent in the room, but it doesn't gain you a whole lot because of the strings of combos and the way the boss moves, so you're honestly better off on the ground. He opens every fight with the same charge attack on the boar, during which he has some sort of weird immunity field, so you can't even like try and clip him as he runs by, and this charge is reused throughout the fight too. And anyone who did this fight early on remembers when he would charge you directly into the entry door on secondary attempts to kill him past the first. This charge's hitbox is an absolute enigma to me. Every time I think I've worked out the correct dodge angle or timing, he clips me ever so slightly. I swear, even with all the practicing that I've done with this and trying to work it out, if you put me in a room with him literally right now, I still think it's pretty 50-50 whether I'd fully dodge it or not, and if I don't, I might just freaking die, because he will actually kill you if you dodge badly and take too much of the attack. The rest of his fight then is fine. I do like the rhythm of some of his combos, and some of his abilities are quite fun to actually dodge timing wise, but then pretty much anytime the boar itself does anything, I just sort of want to cry, so that evens this whole thing out at a C for me. Then we have Count Emir, Mother of Fingers. I love this guy. I think this fight is hilarious. He just deposits loads of fingers out of his chest and then yells at you, and that's honestly great. The fight is definitely not what I would call the most challenging or enjoyable in either sense, but I think the concept of it is hilarious, and purely on that alone, he does get his way into the C tier. Dancer of Ranah, the tenant of the Southern Nameless Mausoleum. I've got a slight soft spot for this one, both because I love the whole underwater cave to have to reach the island sort of thing, and I also really enjoy using the weapons that you get from her. But the fight itself is generally just sort of fun. She constantly uses the dancing attacks of the blade, which creates a sort of tension and asks you to find the opening to get a flinch and interrupt the chain that she's doing so you can keep attacking her. It's fun, and it's a memorable fighting style to actually go against, but it's not like something that I'd walk around to my friends and be like, oh hey, do you remember the Dancer of Ranah? What a fight of the DLC. So I do feel like C is right around the right spot for this one. Then we have Curseblade Labyrinth, and I know other people are sort of annoyed by the Curseblade fighting style of these enemies, but I do love this enemy type, and I love that this specific one basically just casts the darkness spell to use a sort of stealth against you. Once you work out that you can just exit the radius of the spell to remove the whole invisibility, it becomes honestly a really easy fight, but I enjoy the enemy type that is around in the general game like this, and I like this little bonus mechanical interaction, even if it is basically otherwise just an enemy that you find somewhat commonly in the DLC, and it sort of actually makes it feel like a boss version of them. Then we have Chief Bloodfiend, and he's basically just a big version of the Bloodfiend enemies. Lots of health, higher stagger requirements, higher damage, and the thing is, these guys are actually sort of nasty when they are scaled up like this into a boss. They do a lot of big hits relatively quickly, they have decent gap closing ability, they have big AoE jump attacks, and I actually really enjoy fighting a boss version of one of these, especially in a DLC with so many incredibly long combos, delayed hits, and roll catches. It's sort of nice to just fight a big, slow, smacky enemy once in a while, and that's why it comes up to here, despite just being essentially a scaled-up regular DLC enemy. Then we have one that I am eternally just sort of conflicted on, the Golden Hippo. Not quite a Remembrance boss, but incredibly memorable nonetheless. However, while I think the fight is mostly quite an enjoyable and unique experience, I love the phase 1 transition with the first time that you see it, when he grows all the golden thorns. It's extremely cool, but I do have two really big gripes that bring it down into this tier. First, the size of the arena. The boss is too big and covers too much ground too quickly for the size of his hitbox as well in relation to the actual room that you fight in. It just feels incredibly claustrophobic to fight this, and while I don't mind an occasional ledge to fall off of, like the Margit fight right near the start of the base game, I think it needs to be relative to the size and moveset of the boss as well. And this boss's room feels like it missed the mark entirely. There's too many moments where you walk into a wall or a corner just trying to positionally move around the boss. And the second thing, the hitbox on the Hungry Hippo pin grab attack. It is way too wide. It does not feel like it matches the animation, and it hurts me mentally every time that I get grabbed by it. Then to cap off the C tier, the Shadow Tree Avatar. I think this is an extremely interesting boss. I think it's a beautiful creature. I think the 3 health bars that can be lowered with crits in between it is a fun little bonus part of the fight. Not really quite a puzzle, but a bonus mechanic, I suppose, and I like the way that it gains attacks in each phase as well to actually make it feel different. I do think that for a lot of people, though, this is actually probably the least memorable of the Remembrance bosses, because even though its fight is is interesting, it's not particularly fun to engage with, and the attacks are either really easy to dodge for you or incredibly oppressive with very little in between, depending on how you fight. As well, it's also incredibly countered by fire damage and by damage to the head, and once you work out these weaknesses, it just sort of folds like an actual flower in real life. This is essentially the gimmick boss of the DLC, and it's neat, but a gimmick is always a gimmick in the end. Moving up to B then, we have the Ancient Dragon Man. I like this guy, and I like how he just sort of lives blocking off the cave that leads to the entire jagged peak. I love that he invades you when you first go up along his path before entering the cave, and I love that he has just smashed the head off of every goddamn dragon statue on the entire mountain. And I also like that he's likely the first boss most people found that is using a great katana, one of the new weapon types. The fight isn't too bad, he does a lot of jump attacks, he has some dragon stuff, but he has so little poise that you can sort of just trade with him as you find necessary, so it's a fun fight with a fun guy that doesn't overstay its welcome, simple as that. Then we have the Ghost Flame Dragons, and I'm sort of lumping them all together even though there is one that also spawns skeletons as you get into lower health. These are a neat variation on the dragons from the base game, and it's enough of a difference to fight an undead dragon that I don't just feel like they are a carbon copy like some of the other enemies that were added. They look really cool, and being undead does actually change the way a number of things interact with them mechanically. I also do think the way that they play around with being essentially hollowed out, firing flame from their chest skeleton cavity or out of their feet is a fun addition to this too. Basically, I just think they're neat. Not a whole lot more, but nothing less either. Then we have the Lamenter, which is one of the easiest bosses in the DLC really, but it's just so funny and unique as well. It's just a little guy who is constantly freaking out and screaming, and then occasionally he'll summon a bunch of shadow clones, and you need to work out which of them is real. If you don't get rid of the clones, you get a special interaction too, so this is one of those fights that is just sort of a really neat concept. Not overly engaging as far as the actual combat when you're doing it, but it is a cool encounter to have in the game. Following that is Rakshasa, boss of the Eastern Nameless Mausoleum. This boss just looks sick. The armor is great, the glowing red katana is so cool, and while the fight can definitely be a bit irritating because it's essentially just a super high damage glass cannon that has way too much poise, all it takes is finding some damage from range or doing enough poise damage to break through the combos, and then you'll get through it pretty dang fast. It's a pretty unique fight for sure, a very cool enemy, and in a way it asks you to solve a problem you aren't often asked to, an unending barrage of swipes left to right with a ton of poise behind them. Then we have another remembrance boss, Maidhir, the Mother of Fingers. I think she's pretty fine. I love her lore. I think she's extremely important to understanding the world of Elden Ring in general, and I think that the fight is definitely interesting, but it's also very irritating to me. Her attacks are conceptually cool, the way she moves is freaky in the good way, it matches her very strange body, and her magic is really cool to actually see in action too, but the fight itself is either piss easy if you are a long range or magic user, or if you're a melee user, it's just a barrage of really irritatingly large and unusual, unpredictable hitboxes. I'm not sure I would call either of these experiences fun exactly, but that's why despite all of the other parts of it that I really do like, it is still in the B tier. Then we have the Death Knights back to back, both versions of them. I like the long haft axe one slightly better than the twin blade one just because of the moveset, but they are both very, very cool, essentially the personal guards of Godwyn, wielding incredibly cool weapons, each of them, and instead of having heals like many of the other NPC style fights in the expansion, which is drink a flask, these guys can occasionally pull out full-on wings and do a pin attack on you that drains your health and can heal them right back up to full. This is fun because the fight in general is actually pretty fair and engaging. It feels good to play with, but there is the ever-looming threat of this grab possibly coming out, and rather than a grab that instantly kills you, makes you reset the fight, this one causes the more agonizing pain, honestly, of resetting your enemy to full health while you slowly dwindle down on your resources every time it hits you. And it's also a really cool representation of the concept of a Knight of Death as well. After that, I've got Divine Beast Dancing Lion. It is the first remembrance boss that most people find, and it is memorable for a lot of reasons, but I can't help but have a sort of soft spot for him. The fact that it is just two guys who are essentially brought back from the dead standing on top of each other's shoulders. The jaw movements are literally controlled by the arms of one of the guys, and then there's just the fun of the elemental swapping phases too. The movements are a bit hard to track, the arena feels a little bit smaller than I'd like, and the camera does absolutely have some issues with the shape of this boss sometimes, but everything outside of that I do actually quite like for its actual, place and position being so early in the DLC. Then we have one that I'm probably going to have a bit of extra personal bias points for, which is Red Bear, the final mausoleum boss on this list. I love everything about this guy. He literally was just a warrior who fought one of the Great Red Bear boss type enemies, killed it, he won, and then afterwards he was so inspired by its glorious strength that he decided he wanted to become one. No more, no less. He wore its pelt, he used beast magic, he used its own claws as weapons, and the fight is just unique in that he's the only proper boss enemy that uses beast claws, and he's just a really neat guy overall who I have so much respect for as a person. Finally, in our B tier then, we have the Putrescent Knight, and I'm pretty back and forth on this one. The first time that I fought it, I really didn't like it. I found it super unintuitive how it moved because it's not humanoid in the slightest. Its timings, its combos, all of it felt like it was made to catch out people who weren't expecting it, especially the really long combo where the horse runs at you and then the actual skeleton charges at you and then it sort of goes back and forth. And I still think all of that's true, that it applies more to people doing it for the first couple of times, because the more and more that I fight it, the easier I realize it actually is. It is all just memorizing a pattern and repeatedly knowing how to deal with it. It is engaging and fun once you know these patterns, but it's just a really weird movement set to adapt to originally, and the fact that it's just a horse whose skeleton has come to life to fight you is metal as hell, so I guess there's that too. Then moving on up to the A tier, these are all the bosses I think are incredibly well made or just tickle me for a specific reason, some combination of the two, but nothing on this tier is quite perfect, just in the upper sort of section of them all. Starting this off then, I have Black Knight Garou, and he's just at the bottom of this tier because I know entirely that it's ridiculous that I love this guy, that he's even as high as he is in the first place, and the reason that I do is quite simple. He has an attack, his own unique attack, that shoots out a frog-like tongue at you, and if it hits you, he pulls you right back into him. It is so silly and funny, especially coming out of such a hefty, scary knight's armor set, and I'm honestly really sad that I can't have this skill myself to use against people, either as a weapon skill or a spell, but it's just such a funny and unnecessary bit of extra personality for this one enemy that it makes me really adore his whole existence and his little out-of-the-way fort. Next up, Demi-Human Swordsmaster Ons. This guy is essentially just Elden Ring Yoda. He wields what is basically a lightsaber katana, which is cool as hell. He's acrobatic as hell, lots of flips, and while there is another one of this guy out in the wild that isn't a boss, and that does actually sort of take away a little bit from him, there is only one more, which makes him near unique, and their moveset is so both silly and fun to actually fight that I really just love this guy, especially considering he's not even supposed to be a particularly important boss in the progression of the DLC itself, so it feels like he hits very hard for his station, so to say. Then we have Yori the Elder Inquisitor. This is an incredibly unique fight, very odd weapon that he actually uses. He has new incantations that he will use against you. He teleports with faith magic, which is something that we can't even do, and he basically uses spirit summons of his own people throughout the fight, which creates a very unique encounter within the game, a very memorable one, and he himself is also very special. He is essentially in a position where a Death Knight would normally be, as far as the actual patterns that the game has been building, but you find that Death Knight dead earlier at a prior spot in the dungeon, which is where you get the Death Knight armor set, and instead you find Yori at the end, blocking the entry to the entire Abyssal Woods region. Then I've got both Ravla and Rugalia, the Great Red Bears, one after the other, with Rugalia ever so slightly just because I actually like that one a little bit better. Like Red Bear then, this is definitely a personal bias positioning and a love of bears as animals that I have personally, but I think that they are a fun variation on the big bear fight concept from the base game. They are much bigger and scarier, they've got new movesets, they're difficult if they hit you due to just having super high damage output and a lot of combos as well, but they're also very learnable and counterable and avoidable, and I enjoy actually fighting both of them more than most of the bosses in the DLC as well, so there's that. Then we have just all of the remaining Remembrance bosses one after another essentially, and of course the sort of half Remembrance boss, starting with Romina, Saint of the Bud. I absolutely adore this fight. I think it is one of the easiest Remembrance bosses in the DLC, but the rhythm of it, the atmosphere, the music, the fact that she's basically the guardian of the Sealing Tree, and her just being such a strange character concept. I love shit like this that feels like it's almost supposed to be in a horror game but not represented in a way that's supposed to be scary. It's just meant to make you feel sort of uneasy, sort of queasy, and she accomplishes that while still being sort of undeniably beautiful in her own way. I love it all to bits really, and it doesn't feel quite deserving of S tier even so that's why it's here where it is. Then we have Bale the Dread. Bale himself alone is probably high B tier to me, maybe low A tier at a push. I think the fight is atmospheric as hell, it's very, very hype, the lore behind it, Placidusax's severed heads attached to him, it's really cool. But I absolutely hate that his only lock-on point is his head. He is way too big and mobile a creature for that to feel good as a singular camera lock-on point. In Melee, you basically have to free cam it, which does just feel really weird to do after being trained to rely on that target camera the entire game, so that is my main complaint about the fight. Other than that, I do actually sort of enjoy it. That said, it gets bumped up here significantly solely because of Egon, and for no other reason. Egon Egon is unforgettable, and Egon wouldn't be Egon without his white whale, Bale the Dread. Then at the top of the A tier we have Radahn, the final boss. I think he is ever so close to S tier, just on the edge of it. I absolutely adore this fight, and I'm not one of the people that feels like his position is fan service. I don't know how long ahead it was planned, sure, but it feels like it fits within the story to me, and so I have no issue accepting it because the fight we get is really cool, especially as someone who absolutely adored Radahn even before this. That said, phase 1 of the fight is awesome, and while punishing, it is extremely learnable and satisfying when you work out the patterns and how to dodge them. Phase 2 is incredibly tough. The fight is gorgeous, and every single attack is avoidable again once you learn the actual patterns and positions behind them, and for as much as I love this fight, including the incredibly unique grab attack, now that even results in a unique death animation if it hits you twice, I have two very major gripes that keep it just barely out of S tier. One, his combos in phase 2 especially are too long for how short the openings are afterwards. Long combos are fine, but only if the opening that you get, if you actually manage to roll all of these, is large enough to be satisfying as a reward and actually punishing for the boss. Small openings are also fine, but only if they are frequent enough to feel valuable. Putting both of these things together, making it very long combos and very small openings, not only feels sort of oppressive, but it also makes it very hard to properly learn, and more importantly, it invalidates about half of the builds in the game. Are you trying to use charged heavy attacks or jump attacks? Well, you'll probably still be at nearly full power against this boss. Are you using long charged spells? If you don't have Endure, no you aren't. You just won't be able to do that. Using multi-hit build-up builds? Well, if you can't get 2 max bonuses and 2 attacks, again, you're basically just not going to be able to play that build properly because he does not have the openings for that. It's not that it becomes impossible to defeat him with these builds, it just invalidates so many of the player choices that could have been made earlier in the playthrough in a way that feels like it made a lot of people either give up on a build that they enjoyed playing before that a very large amount, or just quit. A lot of people just stopped trying to kill him, and I think there should be some space in between these two things, even for a final boss. The other main gripe that I have then is simply the visuals of the second phase, the massive pile of hair coming off of Miquella, the rays of light after every attack. Again, everything is dodgeable, but all of these effects all over your screen, it just makes it far less intuitive, far less easy to actually see what's going on, and it's far more frustrating to lose to a fight like this when it feels like you lost because you couldn't even see what was coming at you at a given point in a combo. It turns it from being a reaction to the timings of the attacks he's currently doing to having to memorize patterns long ahead of time so that you know how to dodge them without even seeing what's happening. Then we have the S tier for our final entries, the ones that I view as nearly perfect in my own opinion, and the lowest of the three here is Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame. I love how out of the way he is. I love that his first phase is just him before awakening, basically, and then when the actual boss fight starts, the atmosphere of the room goes crazy. His theme is great. He is one of the most immediately imposing figures in the game the second that cutscene hits. His grab attack is super unique and fun as well, and I love the immediate connections that people have drawn between him and Goldmask, and it clearly means that he is a very important piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding the place of the Frenzied Flame as a whole within the world. Past that, I do consider his fight relatively easy considering his station as a very hidden optional remembrance boss, and the literal Lord of Frenzied Flame. After all, a boss with that kind of station could easily have been millennia levels of difficult fight, but he's not, and I don't know if I prefer that or if I would have preferred that he was harder. Instead though, he is really just a very enjoyable fight regardless. He's very learnable, extremely learnable, to the point that pretty much no matter what build I'm playing, I know that I can run at him right at the start of the fight to avoid his first 2 attacks and slap him in the back for about 5 seconds straight. Then he just has extremely satisfying rhythms to his general combos once you learn those too, which the only singular thing I don't like about the fight being the phase transition explosion, which feels like the only way to consistently avoid it is to run as far as you can and just outdistance the attack when it starts, and the room is generally just way too small to have that feel consistent either. Penultimately then is Rolana, the Twin Moon Knight. I love this boss. It has my favorite boss theme out of the whole expansion, the music of it. I love the idea of the magic sword and the flame sword used together in tandem in this way. The room itself is gorgeous and really sets the scene of fighting one of the greatest warriors that this world currently has. And the lore of her basically abandoning her family line to fight for Messmer, explaining her combination of magic and fire as well. Her fighting style is interesting and unique, and she is basically sort of training wheels for some of the hardest fights that exist later radahn in the DLC. She has extremely long but learnable combo strings, and she is far more punishable than the ones that follow, which feels a lot better to me. Her special moves are also all extremely enjoyable to deal with, all extremely well telegraphed, and with their own unique dodge rhythm and openings for you to take advantage of afterwards, with the moon attack, the triple moon, being my personal favorite to dodge and then punish her afterwards. Overall, I just find her an extremely enjoyable fight, and unlike many other bosses, I have absolutely nothing negative to say about this one. Finally, in the top spot then, Messmer the Impaler. My god, what a fight. He may not be the final boss, but it's clear he was the poster boy of the marketing for the DLC for a reason that's much greater than even just his lore importance, because you can feel the absolute passion that went into crafting this encounter. His combos have mismatched timed attacks, he's got roll catches, and he has a lot of dragging animations that make you sort of get caught out until you learn the timing, but he doesn't really have any combos that require more than 3 or 4 dodges in a row, and while they do require some precise timings, he also has some of the largest openings to punish him after you successfully avoid an attack, with great examples of this being the attacks that he uses to start both phases, which rewards you significantly for successfully timing the dodge. The atmosphere of this is great, the mid-fight cutscene is sick as hell, and the whole transformation to phase 2 is just incredible. The rhythm of his attacks in both phases feels great, the telegraphs are all unique enough that even with his slender frame they're all pretty recognizable, and Snake Mode is just one of the more singularly satisfying sections of a fight in the entire game in my opinion, the way that it feels to dodge those attacks, the scale of it all, not to mention his just sheer importance to the lore, not just of the DLC, but the game as a whole. That just about does it for today then everyone. A bit of a long one of course, but such is the nature of ranking every single boss in the entire DLC. I hope you've enjoyed this then, and of course feel free to fight for your own champions in the comments down below. But remember, this list is my opinion. I'm not the decider of objective boss quality or character quality, this is just how I feel about them after honestly probably far too much time playing the DLC myself considering how many days there has been since its release. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.